How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
So today on the Culture Architects Show, we're joined by Chris Deaver. Chris is a leadership coach. He's the co-founder of the leadership consultancy called BraveCore, and he's also the co-author of Brave Together, Lead by Design, Spark Creativity, and Shape the Future with the Power of Co-Creation. Chris has got a pretty interesting background, which we're going to go into. He's got over 20 years of experience in delivering HR solutions and supporting leaders of really big, like Fortune 500 companies like Dell and Disney and Apple. So his experiences with some pretty significant companies. We're excited to look back on those experiences with him and to learn a lot more about his journey in shaping co-creative cultures. So Chris, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here, David.
It'll be fun conversation. So let's just start with some context so our audience knows a little bit more about you. And I find it interesting. So Chris went to BYU and he studied animation there. And that's not normally the background you hear for somebody who's talking about leadership and culture. And so how did you get from animation at BYU to getting into, originally HR and then ultimately leadership? So give me a little bit about that background.
Yeah. I mean, it is unusual to say the least. But yeah, I wanted, I was studying animation. I thought that was, where I was going to go after. I was pursuing that dream. I wrote a letter to Roy Disney, actually.
Wow.
At one point and said, "Hey, love what you're doing. Can you give me a job there?" And, fast forward 3 or 4 months later, this is about the time I was graduating. And I got a phone call from a recruiter, said, "Hi, this is Lisa. Roy said to talk to you."
Wow.
And I wished upon a star, and it worked. And the pixie dust was flying everywhere. This was my moment. And it was the weirdest thing in my heart to suddenly have this feeling that, right company, but wrong time, wrong situation. And so I said, "Thank you." I got off and I just hung up the phone. It was awkward. It was strange because I didn't know what to do with that. Right. So I did a lot of soul searching, and I realized was I had an interest in that, in the creativity space, but where it would converge with leadership and, culture. And so, I ended up doing a startup that focused on mentoring and, brought in mentors like Stan Lee that created Spider-Man and Stephen Covey and a lot of others. And, we shared this with the world, and, that got featured in Fast Company and, Forbes, and, that was, in 70 different countries, hundreds of thousands of people. But then, I got married, and my wife was like, "Hey, it's great you're out trying to, change the world, but we got to pay the bills." So,
that.
Yeah. So I got into the corporate world, and I realized I could aim for all the things I wanted to do, which involved, creativity and leadership and culture in these great companies. And so, I ended up at Dell and then Disney and Apple, and I learned a lot of different things along the way. I tried, capture in the book and share with people. Yeah.
So when you think about, I would imagine, you tell me otherwise, but I would imagine a company like Dell, so they're shipping computers, is a very different place than the creativity of a Disney or even an Apple. So first of all, is that true? And if so, how is culture shaping different in a company of creatives versus, I'm guessing, not that Dell doesn't have anybody that's creative, but that's not their niche isn't to be more creative than everybody else.
Yeah. No, I think we all have, as human beings, an innate creative propensity to express, but there's definitely companies that are kind of squarely in that space of, creating or innovating consistently. And yeah, Dell, I think their approach was definitely more, I wouldn't say quite mechanical, but more focused, on the mechanics of things. But it created an opportunity, right, to ideate or incubate or collaborate, co-create differently. And so a lot of the work was to help amplify that innovation with them. And that's true of any company. I think most companies, and I think where the world's headed is we've gone beyond efficiency, right? The industrial age, we've gone beyond effectiveness of, the information age. And by the way, knowledge has been distributed. It's democratized. Everybody can find it on ChatGPT or Google. It's like, well, what's the future? The future is those things are still in place, and you got to work harder and work smarter. But now it's about working creatively together with others, and the co-creation is the new wave, because it leads to innovate. It creates innovation, and we need more of that to solve for the kinds of challenges and problems and opportunities that lie in the future. Give one example. There's an advisor I work with, and he works with a company, a startup, that they were looking at school buses, and school buses are, I don't know that people would, most people would say, hey, we're going to innovate school buses.
Wouldn't be my first thought as a place of innovation.
Yeah, because it's probably never happened, right? So here we are, but it's not that great a product. And so what they did was they, first of all, solved for, the environment. So they created an EV school bus, and the experience for the kids inside is not this clunky. It's much better, say luxurious, but it's a better experience overall. And it's gone gangbusters, right? Hundreds of schools across the nation. The company became a unicorn, so it's $1 billion value. And that was an idea that, find a vacuum and expand into it. And if you do it with innovation and co-creation, there's a lot of places to find like that. And you can, and it involves getting the right culture, because if you do that, you start to create what's perpetual motion, right? It's people powered to create those kind of ideas. Yeah.
So I want to go back a little bit to history and then bring it back to where you just were. But I still, if I'm an audience member, I'm thinking, all right, so again, Chris studied animation, and then next thing I know, he's working with all these big companies, teaching them leadership and mentoring, et cetera. Like, who thought you had credibility? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but okay, the guy just got out of BYU studying animation. Why am I turning to him as a leadership coach?
Who was I? Who am I?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great question, honestly, too. The funny thing was, so I ended up going back to school. So I did the mentoring network. I did my business degree. So that was the point of like, hey, let's make some money for real. And so I did this, and, got a business degree, which I think gave me a good point of view about the different angles of business, right? To understand it and to unpack it. And, then I wanted to go to Apple or Disney post that, but they didn't give me the time of day. So those are that was actually my dream list, but Dell was available. Okay. And, I thought, hey, it's got a pretty good reputation, this company, but, I show up there, and, this is funny. I just, I get involved in, of course, HR.
So what did they hire you to do? What was your first role there? They hire you, your job is what?
Essentially HR advisor or generalist, type role. I kind of rotated through a few things, but I, started on kind of the OD side and was looking at, strategy questions as far as organization strategy. And so, that it just gave me a lot, like a grounding in, what is the corporate world like? What's it like in a company that's, tech? So they had a certain approach to agility, and trying to kind of win the future. And that gave me enough context to start building. And I started coming up, ideas. And I wrote a white paper to Michael Dell. It was like 33 pages of here's what's wrong with the company. Here's what the future looks like. If you want to get there, here's what you got to do. Wow. And it sounds crazy. I pulled a team together to do this. So we tested a lot of it. We iterated. And, it was a potentially career limiting moment for me, because my manager brought me in and she's like, what was this email to Michael? And I said, well, we were in an all hands meeting, and he said, and, the company was in some challenges at the time. He goes, hey, if anybody has any ideas, feel free to, reach out. And I said, he said this. And she said, well, executive, they say that, but they don't really mean. I said, well, we're a company that has integrity, right? That's one of our core values. And she's like, well, Bob's aware. And Bob was the VP of HR. I said, okay, well, Bob's aware. So I guess, let's see what happens. And, fast forward the next day, Michael responds at 5 a.m. and says, Chris, huge respect for this initiative. What are the next steps?
Wow.
And I didn't know what the next steps were, but I knew we could figure them out. So we started doing that. I ended up actually in a meeting and asking Michael for with my team for $5 million to help essentially fund some incubation and ideation around some of that work. So that was pretty exciting. Yeah. And
Very cool.
we had $1 billion app that came out of that. I mean, there were some things that I started to learn, and I thought, well, if you could do this here, what can I do these other places? And then Disney reached out, started work with them, and that was a blast. So yeah.
And so let's talk about the difference between, again, a company of creatives and others who, to your point, we all have some creative ability inside us. And your example is a great one. If you can innovate around a school bus, then you can innovate around just about anything. But I imagine that, I'm guessing, you can tell me otherwise, that in a company of creatives, creative people whose job it is to be constantly creating, I'm imagining they think differently in some respects. Is there anything different in your experience about building a culture there than in a company not of creatives?
Yeah, I mean, creatives are already leaning in, right? They're already looking for, they're on the edge of reason, right? They're the misfits usually. Call them the crazy ones or call them the brave ones, right? But they're the ones that are saying, I don't fit in, and that's okay. I'm an anomaly, and we're all anomalies here. And if you have a bunch of anomalies together, it's crazy and wild, but the stuff that can happen is truly amazing. I mean, and I experienced that, personally at Apple. I saw it with Disney, at Pixar, and some of the companies they acquired, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and at Disney at its best too. And I think, in startups too, or anywhere, in any company for that matter, I think. But I think in particular, your question is, because if you have those creative muscles in place already, it's just a different rhythm, right? They're already doing it all the time. It's not to say other companies or people or teams can't do it. In fact, I think we're already moving in that direction, because as you look at generationally,
right,
people are leaning into those creative muscles, and it happens in civilizations over time. Well, we're very good at science. We're very good at the logical side of things. Well, naturally, we move into the pathos or the arts or humanities, and we start to balance those out. The other has had more airtime, and it's like, well, and actually it's striking that balance. There's great power in that. And these businesses don't ignore the business, these companies don't ignore the business side. What they're doing is they're leaning into the creative, and they know that the input is what creates the output, right? So greater innovation that has such a marketplace impact as far as profitability, it starts with the internal inputs of just powering and creativity, and not just creativity in the sense of like, hey, we're going to go make a bunch of paintings and there's a bunch of art stuff. It's like, actually it's best ideas win, and that could be in pursuit of something that's very tactical, right? It's like the solution that just accelerates something for a customer. It makes a difference in their lives.
Right. So what I hear you saying is then that from your perspective, creativity isn't necessarily limited to what we think of as arts and music and that kind of stuff, but creativity is perhaps innovation. It's looking at things in a new way, and the things we're looking at in a new way could be, like you're saying, delivering something to the customer in a better or more efficient way. If we're creative about how we look at that, we come up with better ideas.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we all feel this, right? In our personal lives, we experience flow, right? And you experience flow in whatever it is that you love to do. I mean, it could be in reading, could be in writing, could be in a sport, or an actual creation of something like a craft, right? Woodworking for some people, painting. And so then that also raises the question of, well, what if you could feel, because what happens in flow is you step outside of time, right? It's a beautiful feeling. You could do this in nature, right? You step outside of time. It's like, whoa, there's waves, there's mountains, I'm outside of time. But the other question is like, what if you could do this in a team setting, right? And we see teams moving in, sport, like basketball, moving as one. That's like shared flow. And so then the creative question for companies, teams, cultures is, what if you could experience that all the time in a meeting, right? Where it's very fluid, like Bruce Lee would say, be like water. And you bring ideas to the table that are yours, other people bring theirs, but really revelation happens as you converge, and the magic happens because, that's the power of innovation. It's like things that we didn't imagine before, because creation creates space for more creation. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a pretty tactical question, but okay, yes, that would be wonderful if our companies had that kind of culture that encouraged that embraced that. How do we do that? So you're a company, you're an audience member listening to this, and they're saying, hey, I love what Chris is saying. My company is a manufacturing company. We're making some kind of product that isn't all that fancy. And I'd love my people to be more innovative, more creative, to look at things in different ways. How do I create a culture that makes that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. It's simple, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Just, start by, and this is a question, I think what you're asking too, in particular is, and it's about leaders too, and the future of leadership, because you could be in any context, any domain. And let's take manufacturing, for example, and let's say a leader or a general manager or a director, VP, somewhere in there, right, where they're leading. And the difference between, for example, leading with answers and being the expert versus the shift towards leading with questions and empowering people. And so that alone creates space. It creates a brave space for creativity to happen. And what it does is, and when we talk about creativity, what we're really saying is there's all this potential energy. Like we talk about the brain, right? And who knows if this research is actually true, but it sounds interesting. It sounds pretty intuitive. Like there's something true about it, which is we use 90% or 10% of what's, available there. And who knows what exactly it is, but I think there's some truth to, there's some potential energy in there we can unlock. And that's probably true of most people, most teams. And so what is that creative energy or potential energy for problem solving, for taking the business to the next level that, we're not tapping into? And so for a leader to simply say to themselves, well, and I'll give you the journey of this. And there's several journeys, actually. I mean, Steve Jobs went on one from being, kind of the abrasive, kind of rough Steve version of himself to what was a change Steve. He had to go through the valley. He got fired from his own company, right? The wilderness. And part of it was he was the answer guy going around giving answers, at least part of it. Now, what he learned in that process of a lot of pain was how to be more empathic, how to listen more, how to lead with questions. And we had an experience sitting down with Ed Catmull, who started Pixar, with Steve. And he said, and he's a smart guy, PhD, early days of Pixar. He worked on Star Wars too with Lucasfilm. But before that, he would go around and just give answers. People ask questions, just answer. And he said he was not empowering anybody. He also felt exhausted. And so it just wasn't working. And his wife said, she told him to go on this meditation retreat. And all he could do is ask questions and listen. That's it. And he said it was 7 days. So after the first 2 days, though, it was driving him crazy. He's like, I was done. This is terrible, but he stuck with it, and it changed his life. And then it changed him as a leader, because when he came back, he would just ask questions. So when you ask questions, you put it back on your people and it's not absolving responsibility. What you're doing is you're creating a connection to create. And he found that, look at the result. You have a perpetual motion machine, which they say in science is impossible to create, but it's not impossible in culture. Culture itself can be the perpetual motion machine when it's done well or properly. And so that's what they've created now. Inside Out 2 just is an amazing movie. It just hit, Pete Docter and the whole brain trust that created it. But the brain trusts were started with, Ed and the team. And it's just like, they have this momentum. And to your earlier question, okay, what the manufacturing team or pick a team, right? IT or, at a school, right? Like how do they do this? Well, questions create space, that, and in art, the negative space is just as important as the positive space. And people appreciate being part of the conversation. And what if instead of sending out a meeting agenda a week before or a purpose statement, what if it's a question, and it prompts people to be thinking about what their position or what their thoughts are in this. And it's simple, but small and simple things can have powerful results.
I'm guessing, and tell me if I'm not thinking about this accurately, but I'm curious. I would imagine in most organizations, when you shift from the leader providing answers to the leader asking questions, it takes time for the team members to adjust to that. In other words, if you've operated in an environment where the leader's always had all the answers, you learn not to think very much. And now the leader says, okay, I got some questions. Well, I'm waiting for you. What's the answer, boss? And how do you get people shifted into starting to release that willingness, that openness to contribute when they've been conditioned perhaps to wait for the answer for someone else?
That's a great question. I'd say it depends is the short answer, because, everybody's different. They're like, it's like, as you asked my dad, it's like snowflakes. They're all different when you get down to the molecular level, right? But I will say, like, a best test of this, though, is like that how people will be pleasantly surprised is how you approach. If you've shifted, if you've taken a different approach, maybe there's some skepticism initially, or maybe there's also that question of just like, hey, this isn't my style, right? So you have to kind of navigate that. But I will say, like, having tested some of this myself and iterated, whether in the corporate kind of settings I've talked, or in coaching, consulting, I've also done it with my kids, and I have teenagers, and most people would tell me or warned me, right? They're like, that's the rough, teenager. I'm like, well, actually, I've enjoyed it a lot. It's actually, and and sometimes you have to go into like true coaching mode, but I think the questions are so powerful, especially, and again, it goes for anybody. And I guess to your point though, is like, personalities can be different, and in a work setting, like, well, some people may just be more introverted and they don't want to answer a question. And I think just respecting that space is okay too. Right. So figuring, hey, and I have a son who I have two sons, and they're polar opposite personalities. Like, one, I could ask him questions, he would just fire back answers. We could have debates all day long. We do. And it's fun. Right. And my other son, it's just like, he's cruising, but he's in observation mode. He sits back, doesn't necessarily like questions, I can tell. But you kind of figure out those things, the approach that kind of works best. And I think that's also the creative kind of humanity side of the heart kind of question to this, is like deep empathy. Do we have compassion for people to stay in it, right? To stay in it. And, that's important for leadership of the future.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation as I think about that, because I think about times over my career when in teams that I've led, and maybe we're doing a strategic planning session or something like that. And some members of the team, to your point, are really good and they're agile about, oh, that's an interesting idea. Well, what about this? We could do this. And there are others, you ask them questions and they need time to sort of think about it for a while. They're less comfortable, probably by personality. I mean, some of their discomfort could be because they've existed in environments where they're not supposed to speak. But even in a freer environment, by personality, some people, it seems, to your point, are just, their thinking style is to go into my corner and contemplate and then come back with a thought. And other people's thinking style is more, hey, what'd you say? I got an idea. And then we're bouncing off each other.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you, I think, an extreme example of this that shows the power of the invitation. Because I think we tend to, if anything, we tend to lean probably so much further on kind of the answers and kind of the buttoned up, version of things. I would say avoiding the conversation, but maybe not diving as deep as we can. And an example of this, and Apple's tends to be incredible at, inclusion and giving people opportunity to have a voice, think different, right? That's part of the culture. The work I did there was, hey, this is great. Let's work different together as well. So it was like, how do we build horizontally, across teams? And I went in, I did this in Europe, we did it in China, Israel, but in China especially, and in Asia, what we found was oftentimes, and we had this challenge culturally, was an Apple University would come in and try to solve for this, and they had genius folks from Stanford, Harvard, Yale, tackling things like this. And the question was, how do we level up from a culture of deferring, right? Where they'd be in these meetings and leaders would just say, well, they just wait for the director or the VP to speak, and they would just respect that, and then it's over, right? Like that's the answer, right? but we didn't want that at Apple, because the culture of Apple is not challenged for just to challenge its own sake. It was, hey, let's have a robust conversation. So we have stuff in the ether and we can pick what makes it the most sense, what's best. And so we wanted to build that. And the fundamental cultural notion was, again, working different together. And it's this idea of like, hey, have infinite variety of voices, and let's come together and build unity around that. And that was the kind of conversation. I worked with Zinjan. You know, he runs, the Asian teams in Asia, R&D. And we prepped these sessions and these conversations to really dive deep into giving that permission, right, to wrestle with and to have, empower them with questions, ask a lot of questions. And he and I co-facilitated this. And the amazing thing was, we get 30 leaders in a room, we're doing this, and it's just like night and day. So they originally in these big meetings, and Apple University guys teaching, and he asks questions and it's just dead silence. The VP answers and that's it. But we go into our sessions and we're doing this, and it's the same group of people, but they're lit up. And they're on fire, and they're asking their answer. They're like, hey, well, this is how I do it. And he looks at me, he goes, I've never seen them like this before.
Wow.
I said, well, and in my mind, I'm saying, but we haven't invited them to do this in this way, right? And also the framing, it was a set of principles, right, which had to do with, things we're talking about, questions and, involving kind of focusing on the North Star, but there's also something about sharing. And Apple was a company too that had, there's a fundamental around secrecy in the culture. And this can happen in any company, is what gets shared, what doesn't, is knowledge power, right? This kind of thing. But we were able to break through all that. And it was powerful because they felt like they could then, let's call it what it is, like really lead, right? In a meaningful way, their teams.
That brings us to the end of the first part of my conversation with Chris Deaver, leadership coach, co-founder of BraveCore, and the co-author of Brave Together. In the next episode, we stay on the subject of company culture building across different societal cultures, and we go into the particular approach to culture building being embodied by his company, BraveCore.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.